Good afternoon, good readers and watchers. And it's a bit hot today, so there may be some perspiration in the air. But however hot it gets in southeast Queensland in February, it's nowhere near as hot as it gets at the site of the book that I am reviewing today. We of the Never Never by Mrs Aeneas Gunn. This is an Australian classic of very, very high pedigree, if you will. And if you're Australian, you've heard of it. If you're Australian of approximately my age, you may even have read it in school, high school, or even university. If you're younger or a new Australian, you may not have heard of it. And if you're not up for the book, there is a very excellent movie. It's been a while since I saw it. Someone who has seen it recently commented in the description by all means. It was a really good movie. So my edition here is a Vintage Classics Centenary edition, of which I'm very fond. The cover art, which is majestically impressionistic in its colours, while still maintaining a fair level of true-to-lifeness, is by Edwin Perugia, and was purchased from them in 1970. Now, the author of this book is Mrs Aeneas Gunn, as it says here, but Mrs Aeneas Gunn was born Jenny Taylor in 1870 in Carlton, Melbourne. So she was Australian born, though from the tenor of the book they clearly considered themselves Scots Australians. And at that stage Australia was firmly in the we are British phase of its life. Now this book was first published, my understanding is in 1907, though this one is describing it as first published in 1908. Certainly the dedication, which is dedicated to the bush folk of the Never Never, was written from Hawthorne, again in Melbourne, in 1907. And it is an exceptional book. So it's autobiographical in the sense that Jenny wrote it about her own experiences in 1902. And so this is literature. It's phrased in the terms of a novel, but it really isn't. It's autobiographical. And it is what I'm finding people today are calling colonial fiction or colonial writing. Not everyone values that, but I feel that unless you know your history, unless you know where things came from, then you're never really going to understand the now. And I have a great value for it, and that's why, even though I had not previously read it, I was determined to read it. Now, while I do have this beautiful vintage copy, and I did read from it during the experience, I actually listened to most of it as an audiobook from Bolinda Classics. It was read by Marie Louise Walker, who did a fantastic job of narration. And there's an introduction by Bud Tingwell. I've got no idea who that is. I should probably have looked it up before I did this review. But this review is very much first thoughts. I just finished this half an hour ago on the road on the way home. So, Jenny Gunn, born in the late 1800s, she sounds like she's probably a quite interesting woman in her own right. She certainly could, in her own right, she can certainly write beautifully. She matriculated through Melbourne University after being educated at home, and she ran a school with her sisters in the late 1880s, through to the 1890s, after which she was a visiting teacher. And sometime in 1900, I would guess, she met her future husband. That was Aeneas James Gunn. And she married him on New Year's Eve 1901, which is kind of romantic and cute. Now, Aeneas James Gunn was one of those multi-talented guys that were very much the staple of early Australia. He was a pastoralist, he was a journalist, and he was apparently an explorer and a member of the Presbyterian Church. I don't know why that matters, but the internet seems to think it does. He was also a shareholder of Elsey Station. Now, Elsey Station, I believe it still is a pastoral lease, and it once operated as a cattle station. If you look it up, it's in the Northern Territory of Australia, which is why I've got to say the heat that it gets to here cannot compare with the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is blasting. So the station itself situated 14 kilometres east of Mataranka and basically in the middle of nowhere. And this book begins when Mrs Gunn, Jeannie Gunn, has travelled with her husband to Darwin. So it starts in Darwin. Throughout this book, she refers to her husband as the Malacca. The Malacca being a name, or Maluka. It's spelt Maluka, but it's pronounced Malacca. Not sure which one. This is apparently a title that was given to him by the Indigenous Australians on the pastoral properties, and it stuck, and everyone ended up calling him that. How they got to Darwin isn't ever mentioned in this book, but I would guess from things that I've read that what they did was they sailed by ship from Melbourne all the way up the east coast, around the Torres Straits, and then into Darwin. And it's interesting because, well, not everyone values this older fiction. I have a great value for it, and it is basically describing a world that is completely gone and will never come back. And it's people who lived in it who will never exist again. And it's being described, the time and place is being described by someone living in it. And Jeannie Gunn, or Mrs Aeneas Gunn, whichever she prefers, was a fantastic writer. You get a sense of adventure and exploration, of discovering a world that she'd never seen before, and we have never seen before, and we never will. So while we think of the early 1900s as being very far back in time, primitive, essentially historians will tell me that in the 1900s Australia was already very thoroughly urbanized, and someone who grew up in Melbourne was essentially an urban creature. They probably never went out into the bush. And so we've got this relatively young woman, and certainly a very adventurous, very humorous, very light-hearted woman who faces the overland trip from Darwin to Katherine and then out to the Elsey station. And it's marvellous. The writing is light-hearted and happy and really, really good quality. This is a book by someone who loved reading and loved words and was the wife of a journalist. I suppose that's part of it. And while it's understated in the way of its time, one gets the sense that she was very, very much in love with her, the Malacca. But she was also in love with the land. This is a gentle romantic novel in that it describes romantically a part of the world that was far from romantic. The Northern Territory, even today, is dry and harsh and often very unkind on the people who are there. But Jeannie Gunn faced it with such joy and enthusiasm and such a sense of adventure that it really comes through how much she enjoyed it. So travelling from Darwin to Katherine, Katherine's this tiny place. It had a pub and maybe a few dozen houses at the time, which is funny if you know what Katherine is like today. And then they travelled on horseback, basically out to Elsey Station. And all the small difficulties that were thrown in her way. So in Melbourne, everyone assured her that she couldn't possibly survive in the outback because women just didn't go there, which is where this sense of she must have been very, very attached to her husband to try it, because every point of the way people tried to turn her back. In Melbourne, they told her she couldn't survive in the bush. In Darwin, they told her she would never survive on a station. In Katherine, they told her there would be no place for her on a station and the men would be out mustering, and she couldn't go out mustering, obviously. And she ignored all of them and travelled on horseback with just one pack on the back of her horse to last her for months until the bullock train got through after the wet. And the wet is what is called monsoon in other parts of the world. In the entire northern strip of Australia, it starts raining and it stops a few months later. Even today, travel is blocked in many places because everything floods. And back then, there weren't even the facilities in place that there are today. So off she goes on this horse. And there's this fun interplay because when the Malacca has been appointed as station manager, and though he's known to the station, I believe he was a part shareholder in it. The men who worked on there were uniformly against the idea of a woman coming onto their property. They were horrified when they heard that he was bringing the missus. And they did everything in their power to block it by sending telegram after telegram about the impossibility of her possibly travelling there. But she persisted. And that is incredibly admirable in a way and to an extent that women going to inappropriate places in the 2020s can never understand, because it was so unique and so much an explorer. In a way, she was as much of an explorer, and the women like her, she wasn't the only one, as any form of exploration that we can do today. Okay, so they're travelling on these horses through the outback. They are racing the wet. Some of the rivers are flooded and they only just get through. They make it through to the Catherine through flooded rivers. And on one of them, it's so flooded that they daren't ford it with the horses. And they end up putting Jenny on a wire, basically, to cross the river in a flying fox-like way. Consider 1902, women still wore gloves. They wouldn't leave the house without gloves and hats and veils, and here she is streaming across the river on a flying fox wire. It's fantastic. Anyway, for a year they lived on the station, and she tells us all these amazing little adventures like going mustering, and then she will fall into pure lyric description of the beauty of the bush. And the bush is beautiful. I've lived out back and it is amazing. It is stunning. Even today, there's nothing really like it. And people who've lived out there know a thing that people who haven't lived out there don't. It's just like a sediment in your mind of experience. And we all have experiences. This one is not really like anything else. And she loved it. You can tell that she loved every part of that year. The stories are amazing. The characters throughout, the details of the environment, the events of her life, like she was envisaging this huge station, cattle station with a station house and verandas, and she gets there and there's one room and the second one was never completed. There are verandas, but there's essentially one room and nothing else. Which explains why when she was packing at the Catherine, they told her, oh, you don't need pillowcases. There aren't even any pillows. There won't. There were no pillows. Stories of mustering and riding all day and learning to cook bush damper and tea over the fire, the importance of tea, and the beauty of the billabongs and the little tea tree forests that you find. The excitement of a herd of bullocks rampaging. This is just full of beauty from start to finish. All told with that signature humour and enjoyment. Now, because this is historical, we all know that it doesn't end well. And she concludes, this isn't her first book, by the way. Her first book is called A Little Black Princess, and it's about a character who appears very briefly in this novel, but is the main character of that other one. It ends poignantly. Chapter 22 is preparing for Christmas. And then 23 is Christmas. 24 is the thing that happened after. And 25 is very short. And that's the end. Because just after a year after they started out for the Elsey station, James Gunn succumbed to malaria and died, and that's the end of her story. And she doesn't talk about that very much. It's very short. It's basically a conclusion. And then she must have gone back to Melbourne somehow. I don't know how. And she settled down to live the rest of her life, which it sounds like it was productive and interesting. And sometime in the next few years, she started writing, first of all, The Little Black Princess, which was published in 1905, I believe, and then on to this one. This one is magnificent. It's thoroughly worth reading. There are some points about it, of course. It's written over 100 years ago. There are phrases we wouldn't use today. The blacks, lubras, Chinamen, all the words that today, if someone sat down to write a book today, they would be racist. But over 100 years ago, they were just words. And it seems like both Mrs. and Mr. Gunn were very, very egalitarian. They were not racist. They did not see anyone as less than anyone else. And there are constant mentions of things that the Malaga did, or attitudes that Jenny Gunn had that suggest that. But this was a different time. So if people are going to be offended by that, they can be offended. That's a choice they make. But in chapter 22, there's actually a little bit of a rant that is way ahead of its time, when Jenny Gunn talks about the plight of the Indigenous Australians and what they can and can't do on a station, and how this used to be all their land, and the inequality that exists now for them, which will have to be remedied in the future. It's a small passage because this is largely a light-hearted, happy book full of reminiscences of what seems to have been the most joyous and the most influential year of her life. But she does make that comment. And if you have got any desire to have a sense of the past and how we get to where we are, racially speaking, speaking as an Australian, I think this is a very valuable thing to read in its totality, with kindness and understanding. So at the first, this book is dedicated to the bush folk of the Never Never and to the public. It is with the full consent of the bush folk that this 1 year of their lives, the year 1902, is given to the world. Tell them anything you like, they said, one and all, unconsciously testifying to their single-heartedness. Check. Check. Birds from Australia. And in the telling I've striven to give that year as I found it. At every turn the bush folk helped me, verifying statements and furnishing details required with minute exactness. Jenny Gunn from Hawthorne, October 1907. So, and in here we've got a tiny, tiny map of Australia, and if you zoom right into the top there, you will see where Darwin is, and that didn't focus even a little bit, did it? Google Maps will do it better. One thing I am going to do is put a link below. I recently saw a YouTube video for someone who's travelling around Australia, and they actually went to the cemetery from the Elsey station. It isn't located on the Elsey anymore, but it gives a vivid impression of what that bushland is like today. And even today, travelling through it in a four-wheel drive, you feel a sense of isolation, the end of the earth. But you've got a four-wheel drive and you've got air conditioning and you've got water. It isn't the same as travelling across it in horses over 100 years ago, knowing that no one can get to you any faster than a horse can travel. I'm going to read a bit of the prelude, and if you don't want to listen to me reading aloud, that's fine. This is a great book. I think it would appeal to many people who like historical writing, who like light, humorful writing. Anyone who's interested in Australia, I would recommend it. While I've been hearing about this book for years and I've heard that it was a great book, I was astonished by just how good it was. This is, in a literary sense as well as in a fascinating story sense, this is a really good book, and I do thoroughly recommend it. Okay. Where does the title come? We of the Never Never. The Never Never was the name for out bush, so far out bush that you may well not exist. We are just some of the bush folk of the Never Never. Distinct in the foreground stand, and then she gives us a number of characters. And I'm not going to read that out. There are also a couple of names, including Scottish names, that have dated. Read the prelude by all means, but don't let that stop you from continuing on. And all of us and many of this company shared each other's lives for one bright sunny year, way away behind the back of beyond in the land of the Never Never, in that elusive land with the elusive name, a land of dangers and hardships and privations, yet loved as few lands are loved. a land that bewitches her people with strange spells and mysteries, until they call sweet bitter and bitter sweet. Called the Never Never, the Maluka love to say, because they who have lived in it and loved it never never voluntarily leave it. Sadly enough, there are too many who never never do leave it. Others, the unfitted, will tell you that it is so called because they who succeed in getting out of it swear they will never never return to it. But we who have lived in it and loved it and left it know that our hearts can never never rest away from it. Poignant. And perhaps Jenny Gunn's heart never never did rest away from it. And though she died in Melbourne and was interred there, her remains were eventually taken back up to the Northern Territory, to the Elsey Cemetery, and buried with her husband, Aeneas James Gunn. Fantastic book. I do recommend reading it, because I always recommend reading good books.